All right. Welcome back, everybody. And this will be streaming on Thursday. So happy Thursday, everybody. Welcome back to another Future Focus, where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience. Today, I'm looking forward to, we're digging into some of the research. And I love when I get to hear how my qualitative and anecdotal things and conversations measure up with the data. So to join me for that conversation, I am joined by the lead researcher of the Global Sentiment Survey. And for those of you listening, this name probably will be familiar, but I'm joined by Donald Taylor. So Donald, and if folks, if you hear me call him Don, it's because he told me I could. So everybody who listens knows I prefer Christopher. So I'm not being rude. He said, you can call me Don. So thank you, Don, for joining me.
It's a delight to be here. I like it when the data bumps up against the anecdotes, but I also like it when the data and the anecdotes don't agree, and we have to ask ourselves what's happening. Maybe we'll drill down to that in this conversation.
You know what? It is funny because it is nice when it happens, especially when you've been talking to stakeholders and things like this, and they've been arguing with you, and you go, there, see, it's not just me. But to your point, I do also like it when you're like, interesting. So this is what I was thinking. What happened? And digging into it. So, and now how long have you been? Well, for those who may not be familiar with you, so I've been following your stuff for a long time. For those who may not be as familiar, you've been in the space for a bit.
A long time.
What's your background?
I started as a computer programmer in 1981, working on PDP-11s, which are now in there's a PDP-11 it's a digital DEC machine, which is now in the Museum of Computing in the UK. That's how old it is. And those machines had
that's how you know you've made it, when the thing you got your start on is now in a museum.
Made it is one way of putting it. Another way might be that's how you know it's time to move over and let the kids carry on. Anyway, the thing is, that gives me perspective. So I can look back over something like 35 to 40 years of working in learning and in technology. And I can say, this looks like a genuine trend, and this looks like hot air. I've chaired the Learning Technologies Conference in London since the year 2000. I've done this survey for the past 11 years. So I'm getting quite a lot of, as I say, longitudinal perspective on things. And, at a conference, people are always turning up. They're always saying, yes, this is the latest, greatest thing. And then next year, somebody says, this is the greatest thing. And it never is. Yeah. But I do think there are some very major things happening right now, which we'll discuss in the coming hour. And they are real.
Well, and I think that's the part that is, there's always truth. At least my experience has been, even in some of the flash in the pan stuff, there's usually a truth or something deeper that it's itching at that it hasn't quite landed on, but it's like, oh, this is going to be the thing. And it never sustains because it's like, well, it never quite got what it was trying to accomplish and people got distracted with it.
And we could talk about why that happens. And there are some things which are pure fluff and other things which are absolute solid gold. But most, as you say, is somewhere in the middle. And you have to distinguish the signal from the noise and try to work out, okay, what's real here? And also, when is this going to happen? Because always the people who are the evangelists are super excited about something and they say it's already here. Whereas in fact, you're going to have to wait 2 to 3 years for something to actually kick in.
Yeah, that's one of the downsides of being on the front end of that curve is a lot of times you're like, it's coming, it's here. And for quite a few years, people look at you sideways like, I don't know, you seem a little bit nuts. And it's like, well, give it a few years and we'll see what happens. So I'm actually curious, going back down the trip down memory lane. So you started in the computer science space. How did you then end up branching out into kind of the niche of L&D and L&D technology?
Well, I started off programming in machine code and everything on these decks, but I realized that I wasn't very, very good at it. I was okay. But, the truth is, you know what productivity is like with people who code? There are people who are like me, who are journeymen, who can just get things done. There are people who are just super fantastic. And their productivity can easily be 20 times more than somebody who's a regular Joe. And nobody wants to go to work saying, "Oh, great, I'm a regular Joe." No, there may be. I'm not saying anything against people who go to work and do a job and go home. But
I know what you're talking about.
But you don't want that feeling. So I was young enough to be able to make a change and say, "Look, I'm going to change up." I went from computing, went to university, came out, and went into teaching English as a foreign language. That was my first job in 1987 after this
That's a
program.
pretty hard shift. That's a
Yeah,
pretty hard shift of like compute to, is it?
yeah,
I mean,
I don't know. I've always said yes to everything. I'm stopping doing that
okay.
now. It's not a good idea. But I've said yes to everything as a young man, which meant I got a huge amount of experience doing a lot of different things, and that was actually really
Okay.
useful. It proved very useful later on in life. So yeah, it's a weird shift if you're looking at it coherently, but if you're looking at it from hey,
Okay.
let's try a bunch of things that we might enjoy, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you bring that up in the computer programming space because I remember now when we were connecting, getting ready for this, talking some of that shared experience in that. And it is interesting how there's certain fields where the difference between, like you said, just kind of your average Joe or Jane and the great one, like is just night and day different. And it is one of those, there's certain fields where that difference isn't quite as noticeable and you can kind of go through, but that is definitely a field like that. Okay. So you made the shift.
Well,
Now you've been doing this.
hold on. Let me
Yeah.
jump
Well,
back because you're right, and I think it's really important. If anybody's listening to this and thinking, what should I be doing? I think it's much more important now than it was, back in the 1980s
yes.
and 90s, because the
Yeah.
competition between individuals and what they can do is so much more intense and so much more global now. I
Yes.
believe that if you want to make a real success of things, it's best to be the best you can be in your niche in the world, literally in the world. Okay, so just find that niche and make yourself the best at it. Because if you're not, you'll be number 2, number 3, number 4, whatever. But the people who aren't number 1 have their work commoditized, and that means decisions are made on basis of price rather than quality. So I'd firstly define for me, it's a very narrow niche. I really understand about sentiment in L&D globally, okay? Nobody else does. Nobody else has got 11 years of data. Okay, great. So that gives me a niche. It could be anything, but if you have that niche,
Yeah.
go for it. If not, then I'd recommend finding one. But I do think over time, if you're conscious about it, you will find that niche. I'd encourage people to strive to find their niche.
I would agree with you on that. And I think what I've observed over the past, probably, I mean, really, AI has accelerated this
Yeah,
exponentially
yeah,
for sure. It was building up even before this. I think that would have been good advice even 10, 15 years ago. But especially in the past couple of years, I would say that advice is even more wise than it has been in the past. Because to your point, if you're just kind of clunking along doing it, it is going to be hard to differentiate yourself and it is going to be hard to thrive in the age where AI can do a lot of things mediocre. And so if you're kind of mediocre in it,
absolutely. And it's not
you're
just
not only
AI.
competing against other people, not only are you competing against other people, but now you're competing against other people with machines and machines themselves.
Which makes it doubly hard. And look, over my shoulder, you've
Yeah.
got this globe. Now that's people say, "Oh, that's a nice thing," right? Like I bought it in an antique shop, but I didn't. This globe was bought by my mother. I'm the fourth of 4 children. When she had me, the doctor said you can't have any more children because I was a difficult child, and so she took her maternity clothes. She sold all her maternity clothes and stuff, and with the money, she bought that globe as a sort of thing for all of the kids to look at as they were growing up. So this is the world as it was in 1963, the year of my birth. And it's a dramatic and constant reminder to me of how much the world changed because I look at it quite regularly and I see there are countries on there which obviously geographically they exist, but the names don't exist anymore. The names have
Yeah.
changed and things have shifted a great deal. We go from year to year, we don't think about it very much, but over that period, you look at it, there's a lot of change going on. And I think about what you're saying in terms of competition between people, competition with AI, and also globalization. I think about Ashwin Rahman, who was a kid. This is a few years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago. 18 years old. He was working. He had a like a part-time job in his home in Bangalore in India. Right. His part-time job wasn't delivering a newspaper. His part-time job was working as a soccer analyst for a Scottish football team, Dundee United. How bizarre is that, right? Dundee United didn't go down the road and find somebody they found somebody in India. Why? Because A, he was very good, and B, he was cheap, right? He's a kid,
Right.
he's living at home, he's super smart, and he will do all this at a much more competitive rate than somebody at the University of St Andrews, just down the road, who would
Okay.
probably be very good, but the competition's there. So again, individually you're facing a lot of competition. And actually, although people might be saying, hang on, I've tuned into this to hear about the global sentiment survey and find about trends internationally. Actually, these are all very pertinent
These
trends
are.
to what we're talking about.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the thing is a lot of these things. That's why I say I live at the intersection of business technology and human experience, because they aren't these disparate things where you go, well, what is this over here? It's like, well, over there, actually, very much, it's a Venn diagram of intersections on this stuff. And I guess one of the things that I would encourage people, because I do have a much younger generation of folks who are starting to tune into this, is that what can feel overwhelming is you have to figure out your niche like right away. And at least I don't know about you, but even you describing your experience, I actually had a lot of success and just enjoyed, especially earlier on, experimenting with different things to kind of figure out like, hey, what is the flavor of my niche? Instead of feeling like I've got to graduate from university and know, yep, this is exactly what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I think actually that broad experience helped me actually find the niche that I went, this is actually where I'm going to zone in and perfect my craft.
I would 100% agree. And I do think getting that breadth of experience in a variety of different roles is super useful and super important. And actually, the job I came back to the UK from Turkey, where I'd been teaching English as a foreign language. I came back in 1992. And by the time I came back, I had done a really wide variety of things in Turkey, including teaching English all the time I was there. But on top of that, I'd run the sales team. I'd learned fluent Turkish. I'd taken control of the management and production of magazines. I'd worked in a variety of roles as well as teaching, because I've done translation, basically synthesis of ideas and putting them together, a whole bunch of different things, which turned out to be incredibly useful at my next job. This is something that's called retrospective coherence. You get somewhere and you think, well, that was all chaotic. But no, hang on, everything I've done makes sense. And then you look back and you see these stepping stones that lead over to the horizon you've come from. And those stepping stones are all connected by this pathway, which actually makes perfect sense. Find your way by doing the things you're enthusiastic about and where you feel you can add value, and learn every day that you're doing it.
Right. Well, and I think on that, there's going to be things where, I mean, I look back and even some of the things that at the time I would have categorized as mistakes, like, wow, that failed. That was a big colossal. I actually look back at those, and a lot of times those are the things that I go, in retrospect, though, I learned so much from that experience that actually helped form me into who I am today. So even those moments where you feel like, wow, that blew up in my face, like, how am I ever going to recover from this? You end up looking back, and sometimes it takes a while. There were ones that felt like failures for quite a bit, but then you finally do get to a point where you look back and go, oh, okay, that's how that helped me in this new situation. Okay.
I think we're set up beautifully to talk about whatever it is we're going to talk about.
Exactly. Whatever it is. But so I am curious. So you've been doing this sentiment survey now for over a decade. And one of the things you said early on that I think is really interesting that we can unpack a little bit is, having done this for a while now, you've been able to start to see where there are things where you go, this is a flash in the pan, or this middle ground of, this is a flash in the pan, but there's something deeper underneath it that is sustainable. And then there's also these ones where you go, nope, this is a unicorn type of a thing. One, how have you seen that how have you gotten to that point? Let's start with that, because then I'd like to see what you've seen over the years and how that's played out.
So what I ask, one obligatory question in this survey that I ask people, which is, what do you think will be hot next year in workplace learning and development? And we've asked that question in the same format since 2016. And before that, the format was slightly different. Since 2016, we've had a list of 16 things people can choose from, one of which is other. And they can choose one, two, or three of those things. And so it's a very simple format. We've added a few questions over time. So it's now 4 questions, one of which is, where do you live? Another one is, what sort of organization do you work for? And the very important other major question is, what are your challenges for this year, which I hope we'll get to later on. But that key question that we've had for the whole period, what will be hot next year, has enabled me to generate this long tail of longitudinal data where I can say, well, okay, looking over the course of a decade at things, we can see that certain things are predictably reoccurring. So the obvious thing is that if I choose the right options on the list, because typically what happens is at the end of the year, I take one thing off the bottom of the list and I put something new onto it. But if I choose the right thing to go onto the list, then what will happen is that will be something that's just about to take off, or it's something people are interested in. It takes off. It goes up in terms of popularity. People find it more interesting. And then over the course of the years, it declines. So it starts off hot and it ends up as business as usual, maybe. But so if you look at something like mobile delivery, right?
Okay.
On the first survey in 2014, that was number one, and it slowly made its way down until I took it off the list last year. Why? Because mobile delivery was super hot. And as somebody running a conference, I could tell you that people really, really wanted to hear about it in 2014, certainly, but actually they wanted to hear about it in 2007. There was a long period of build-up of interest in that. Super hot. And then now it's pretty much business as usual. Well, at least in developed economies. In other parts of the world.
And would you say with that one in particular, I'm curious with that one, because as you just mentioned the dates there, and it's always interesting to me as I look at different industries where it lags on just kind of like the overall what's going on in the world trend. Because when I think about like mobile delivery specific to like L&D, when you think about when the smartphone really started taking off and got to a point where it was becoming ubiquitous and there was almost an expectation that everybody just goes, well, how? And then we're kind of at a point now where I think about society and people go, I'm not curious about what's going on with mobile because I just expect that everything is that. Is that kind of, where did we sit on that curve?
Well, that's where we are. Yeah. So we've reached the point where in certain developed economies, you can expect that mobile delivery it's not quite business as usual for everybody because there are still practical technical issues. But in terms of it being a hot topic, it is business as usual. You expect that you would be able to do it. Now, that's not true everywhere. So, for example, in South Africa, for example, mobile delivery still remains hot because South Africans rely a great deal on that infrastructure to just get things to happen across a country which is very large, quite sparsely populated. The density isn't that big.
Makes sense.
And where the infrastructure isn't very strong. So mobile remains very important in South Africa. But generally, so in Europe, where about half the votes come from, in North America, we would expect that mobile deliveries is business as usual. So that's one story. Mobile delivery starts off hot, ends up business as usual. Look at curation, which started off reasonably hot when I put it onto the survey and has slowly declined over the years. And I actually took it off the survey some time ago because it had got to the bottom of the table. So the difference there is that they both follow the same pattern of lines. They go up and they come down over the years. But the difference is the context. Curation is nowhere near as universally accepted as mobile delivery is. It's not business as usual. So we can look at the data, we can understand that what the numbers are saying, but we have to add our own context to it. So we know mobile, that was a case where there was a genuine sense of something taking off. I'll come to why in a second. With curation, it was one of these ones where people got excited about something. And then over the years, I think they probably found it's a bit more difficult to do than they thought. It's more complex, it's time consuming. And also, people haven't got a lot of spare time. So it's not like they're saying to themselves, oh, I've got these extra hours in the day, I'll go and do some curation. Everybody in learning development, for as long as I've been working in it, has been flat out. And so it's not like they've got the spare time. Given the choice then between this thing, curation, which is, let's say you've been around for a few years now, and something else that's new and shiny, like analytics, learning analytics, or AI or VR, you might say, if I'm asked the question, what's hot? I'm not going to say curation. I'm going to go for one of these new tools. So there's typically these two types of options. And I would say most of the options actually fall into the curation camp. Most of them are things where people get excited about something which goes on to find a niche. So VR actually is one of those. Very excited about it. It's actually held up very well over time. People are still excited about it, but it's never going to be the next mobile delivery because it just requires more investment of time and money to make it happen. But the other thing, sorry, Christopher, I know I'm talking at great length.
No, but I think even on that, I want to touch on the VR one, but finish your
Okay.
thought, because I think this is an interesting piece.
The final thing is that, look, mobile delivery was a straightforward substitution. We deliver stuff to people and we do it via a PC, all right, or a laptop of some sort. Fine. Well, now we're going to do it via mobile. So conceptually, in terms of what L&D had to do, and in terms of what people were expecting to receive, it was a straightforward substitution. Doing something different is much more complicated. It requires a shift of your,
Yes.
not just your effort, but of your mindset as well, and usually the people you're working with. And so that's another reason why curation has found it much more difficult to take off, and most other things that come out the blocks as being brand new. Now, that's not true for VR. VR is, look, it's like a training room, but it's all in this helmet on your head. And so it has the strength of being a substitution. The downsides for VR are, well, it requires not so much money now, though that is a factor, but not as much as it was 3 years ago, but it requires expertise. And that is still a stumbling block for people. So the substitution effect is not quite as strong. There's something like that there. Right. I'm going to stop, have a sip of water, and hand it back to you.
No. Well, and I think what's interesting about this, and this to me is why I quickly realized as I got into the learning technology space that to me it was more important, not more important, but equally important for me to look at what was going on societally along the technology lens of things. Because that also to me, even the examples you shared in there, was an indicator on, is this going to be a sustainable thing? And when do you pull the trigger on certain things? Because I remember when VR was like massive hype in our industry, and I was looking more broadly societally going, we're not at a state where immersive technology is an inevitability yet, which is like what you heard with the mobile device. It was like, well, once it's societally hit a point where, look, everybody's got one, it's normalized, people are used to it, it's been integrated into their ecosystem of life. Well, then now you have to chase it because there's no way you can go around it. Where immersive tech has been one of those like, there are certain niche pockets where it's picked up. There's certain use cases where it's really taken off. And that's why I think some of the folks who've been following what's been going on in immersive, I think what's happened with the Apple Vision Pro is yet again kind of an indicator of we're making steps closer. But just because some YouTubers do 100 hours in an Apple Vision Pro, like it's still considered like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, why would you? So we're not there yet. And so to me, it's one of those, well, it hasn't graduated to a state where you should just pursue it universally because, well, society is not ready for that yet. And I think that's interesting as you think about like where AI is right now, where you go, there's even some AI plays that you could make that would, I personally think, be a mistake just because you think, oh, AI is all the rage. It's like, yeah, it is, but it's also not. And there's certain things that are going to quickly flash out.
Yeah. Interesting that point about VR adoption, because in the 2022 survey, actually VR had an uptick. Now, all these things typically are on a downward trend, but it had an uptick in 2022, a slight one. And I'm pretty convinced that was due to people spending more time online during pandemic and getting themselves more acclimatized to the idea of doing things online. So I'm pretty sure that was a knock-on effect. It's since fallen away. I totally agree that if you're going to adopt a new technology, adopting it because it's a new technology is the worst reason for doing it. You have to be adopting it because it solves a problem for you, and also because you know that you're pushing an open door, that people are going to be ready to accept it. Bear in mind that the first survey was topped by mobile learning in 2014, and that was 7 years after the iPhone came out. So we had powerful handheld devices for 7 years. And it was still, and exactly, and it was still regarded as a hot topic. These things do take time. AI, I do believe, is transformational for how we live and work, and of course how we learn. But we are also at the beginning of a revolution here. I don't think we're going to see anything near the full implications of this for 20 years, which sounds. It sounds a bit sort of, I'm a futurist and I'm making money telling you this. That's not my job. I'm simply telling you this from the basis of my experience, having been around for a long time, that, these things take time to bed in. Also, there's something else as well. I mentioned that I did this job as a computer programmer. Before I went to university, I saved my money programming, and I spent a year traveling. I went to Africa largely, and I distinctly remember going to Saqqara in Egypt, the ancient initial place where the pharaohs were buried.
Yeah.
And if you go there, you see the very first stone buildings, as far as we know anywhere in the world. These are like 5,000 years old. And fascinatingly to me at the time, there are pillars holding up the roofs, which were carved to look like bundles of papyrus. And in fact, that is a theme that continues as a sort of
Mm.
motif. But the initial ones were carved as bundles of papyrus and bits of wood because, well, that's what you had to hold up a roof. You had wood. And so we're going to make this thing look like a bit of wood holding up the roof.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, when they built the first iron bridge in England, the first bridge made out of iron, nobody had made a bridge made out of iron before. So what did they do? They put the bits of metal together, and then they hammered dowling and joists together to fit the thing together as if it was wood. So it's the same thing as
Interesting.
happened 5,000 years earlier. We use the technology in the way we're used to using it, and from that, we understand what to do with it. So I think the phrase for this
Yeah.
is something like the affordances are emergent, something like that. Okay. You work out how to use it as you go along. We can't tell what's going to happen with AI in 5, 10, 20
No.
years' time. We can look at it and say it's powerful enough. The only thing we can do is get in and play with it, like those people in Saqqara building buildings, like the people building the first iron bridge. Play with it, do what we know how to do, and then we iterate and we understand. But if you wait until the answer is clear, you're waiting too long. You've got to get in and
You're
get your hands
waiting too
dirty.
long. Right. And
Yeah.
that's where I think threading that needle carefully is really important. Now, again, unless you're Eliezer Yudkowsky and you say we've got less than 2 years before AI just completely annihilates all of mankind. But I think that's maybe a bit on the extreme end of it. But two things with it that I think are really interesting that you brought out of that. And I think this is where a lot of the hype around AI misses the mark is that I think back to, I mean, I haven't been doing this as long as you have, but I've been around the block for a while. And I remember when the internet first started taking off, and you saw some of the same hype cycle where it
Sure.
was like the internet is going to be the thing. And so everybody was thinking like internet is it. And it was like, well, no, it just becomes basically the fabric on which everything is made of.
Yeah.
So even when the internet came out, we didn't even really fully understand what the internet was going to do for things until we had time to kind of refine it and say, oh, actually, the internet is just going to refine the way we do this way, or this will be a new innovation that we hadn't considered before. And I feel like that's where we are. But to your point, the analogies you made with the bridge and stuff, I see way too much of that happening, which to me is a bit disappointing with artificial intelligence, where I'm like, really? We have all this power and potential, and all we're doing is trying to recreate the same thing, but make it look different? To me,
It's
it's disappointing.
disappointing. It's disappointing because you're thinking, well, hang on, couldn't we do this and this? We could, but at the same time, go for it. Work out what you can
Sure.
do. Listen, I have this series of things that I use to describe whether something is a revolution or not.
Okay.
You start off with a transistor radio. This is me in my 1970s. I'm in my room at home. I'm listening to my transistor radio. I listen to the radio, and I record Top of the Pops on a Sunday evening on a cassette. Right.
Okay.
Next stage from that is a boombox. Boombox does exactly the same thing as a transistor radio. It is just much louder. You carry it around and you play your cassette or your radio to your mates. Okay.
Yeah. You carry it on your shoulder on your skates down the street. Yep.
Exactly. I'm not on
That's right.
skates for me. I was never that stylish, but
Okay.
yeah, carry it on my shoulder. What happens then, of course, is that the chairman of Sony has all these kids listening to their boomboxes in the park and is driven to distraction and literally takes to his engineer a cassette and says, look, build something that fits around this cassette, does nothing else, maybe plays a radio, and we'll give that to the kids. And your Walkman is born. So the same functionality is there. You've got a radio, you've got a cassette, but the use of it is different. It's now personal and mobile rather than social and
Yep.
mobile, like a boombox was. What has happened there is the boombox was doing the same thing bigger than the transistor. The Walkman is doing the old thing in a new way. It's playing your
Yeah.
music, but in a new way. And the next stage from that is 10 years later, slightly less than 10 years later, you've got the launch of the iPod. You're carrying around music, you're listening to it, looks the same as the shuffle, looks the same as the Walkman, but you're doing a new thing in a new way
Yeah.
now, because what you're doing is you're listening to music, you don't own it. It's down, well, you basically are hiring the right to play this music from Apple
Yep.
iTunes.
And it's
And
even
so
more hyper personalized because now instead of
exactly,
the
exactly.
cassette that only has these many and you have to rewind and find the exact spot, you can go to exactly what you want when you want it in the moment you want it.
So you've gone from a transistor radio cassette player on one hand, right the way through to this new thing, which is definitely doing new things a new way. That is revolutionary. And you go through these steps on the way. Right now with AI, we're at the boombox phase. We are just doing the same thing louder. And if
Yep.
you're making lots of content, great, great. That's boombox. From all those people who are doing that, some people will evolve into doing the old thing, not just louder, but doing the old thing in a new way using AI,
Yep.
and we'll go further from that. Now, bear in mind the gap between 1970 and whatever 2003, right? It's about like a 30-year gap to make that revolution. It won't take that long with AI,
No.
but we have to think. But we have to think that it's going to take a long time.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting about that is I think of kind of the ecclesiastical wisdom of we often say like this is what's new, and it's like really nothing's new under the sun. Like
Yeah.
nothing is new under the sun. Something comes out and we go look at what's new, and you go actually that's what's old, repackaged and maybe repurposed in a different way, which can be a positive and encouragement to people who may be feeling overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, the world's a different world, it's going to be radical. It's like, well, yes, but in many ways it's also going to be very much the same as it always has been. I think the point, though, you hit on at the end there, and I'm curious, kind of tying into this survey, is that window of time that you have to adjust is closing rapidly. I mean, for my podcast, every Friday I do a weekly update on just some of the latest happenings.
How do you
And
keep up, Christopher? How do you keep up at the moment?
I have a lot. People ask me that all the time. They're like, you have 7 kids, you have this other thing, and
Yeah.
you do. But what's interesting about that is it's amazing how even week by week, I'm like, geez, Louise. I mean, I just talked about this last week. And one of the examples of this is OpenAI's Sora capability.
Yeah.
Now, granted, text to video is not new, but the pace at which generative AI has moved from boom, 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 like you're like, good grief, like staying ahead of it. I understand why people have just even a fatigue of, I can't even keep up with what's
I spent
happening today.
I spent a lot of last year, 2023, traveling around talking to people about this, and it didn't matter where this L&D professional was, whether it was in, I don't know, Prague or Paris or London or Las Vegas or Kuala Lumpur, the same word came up all the time. Even if the first language wasn't English, it was overwhelm. I just feel
Yes.
overwhelmed by this. There's so much happening. I can't keep up. And to be fair, Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at Wharton, whose job it is, and does a great job with it, by the way. His job it is to track AI. He wrote, I think, in October or November last year, I just can't keep up. There's so much happening. So I can understand why people feel overwhelmed, but I still say, look, when something's that noisy, it doesn't mean there's no substance to it. There is substance.
Right.
Choose
Yeah.
one thing. Choose one thing, go and explore it, and aim to understand it, then maybe 3-4 weeks later move on to the next thing. Just take your time. But if you do nothing, then you're putting yourself
Yes.
at the whim of these forces rather than trying to guide your own destiny.
Yeah. I think that's extremely wise advice. And I think that's where from a social fabric, we have to work together on this because it really is reaching a point where nobody can possibly be an expert on all of it because it's moving so quickly. You just can't. And so you have to tap into those folks who, hey, maybe this isn't your special. So we need to lean on the folks who are and be able to work together in this. Cause it is, I actually released a short last week that just kind of blew up. And it was one of the leading experts in the field who went, I've been doing this my whole life and I'm spent. Like I am literally just shot because I see what's happening and I almost can't keep pace. And I had a call last Friday with a group of people and you could just see it on people's faces. They're like, I'm just tired. I'm overwhelmed
Mm.
with all of this. And that's where my encouragement to people has been like, just, yes, like you said, engage with where you can to stay comfortable with it, but don't feel like you have to stay up on all of it. You will burn yourself out
Yeah, 100%.
really, really
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah.
Okay. So the sentiment survey, you did it this year.
Yeah.
What were, I mean, I guarantee, and you hinted at this backstage, AI had to have been a big topic on there. But I'm curious what some of the insights that you learned coming out of that were in 2024.
It was the least surprising survey result in 11 years, Christopher, which is, the question is what's going to be hot this year? Well, drum roll, people, it's AI. I mean,
no way. Are you kidding? I can't.
Would you,
it was like,
honestly,
that would have been the most anticlimactic reveal everywhere.
honestly. So, it was actually, for the first time this year, we had fewer people voting, 18% people. Normally it goes up each year, but we had 18% fewer than last year, just because of this reason. The people, why should, I'm busy.
Tired.
Why should I answer this, right? It only takes 2 minutes, but why should I answer? Because, we know what the answer is. Okay. But the interesting thing is, at least now we have a number. We have a number to say, well, okay, how exciting is AI to people? Well, in the past, to be number one on the survey, you had to get something like between 10.5% and 13% of the vote. Okay. So this year, AI came in at 21.5% of the vote. So it's it's mad. It's absolutely enormous across each work group, whether you're working for L&D in a training team, working for a vendor, a freelancer, working in education. Everybody agreed it's AI, and they marked it at least 20%. I have 16 key countries where there's a substantial number of people voting. Every one of those put AI first, apart from Thailand, which put it second for some reason. Actually, interestingly, the vote in Southeast Asia was not quite as strong for AI as it was elsewhere. But basically, everybody in the world agrees it's super hot and important. So great, boring survey finished. Not quite, because there is some other stuff underneath, which is interesting. What lies underneath in the data, and also the anecdotal or the qualitative stuff in the answer to that other question. What is your challenge this year? What's your biggest challenge? So there is other stuff in the survey. I would encourage people to go and download the survey and have a read of it. I'd also, I'm very interested to know what happens next year. I know that's looking forward a bit. I can't believe that AI is going to sustain this level of interest. So I'm very interested to think what happens over the course of the year, and what will happen in February of 2025 when we're looking back and talking about it. Will we be saying, amazingly, AI continues this roller coaster ride of interest? Or will we say, no, people are starting to push back a bit? And if they are, what will that look like? How will people react to AI in learning development? I'm very interested to think about that as well.
Okay. And we'll make sure that we put a link in the comments for this so people can download. So if you're watching or listening to this, check out the show description, and we'll make sure that that's included in there. But to your point, I think it is going to be interesting, because going back to what I said a few minutes ago, AI to me is like saying oxygen is the big thing. You're like, right, but for what? Like,
Exactly.
or water's the big thing. And you're like, well, yeah, I know it's really important, but I don't know. I think so many people just got completely hit like a ton of bricks in 2022 when generative AI took the market by storm, and everybody just went, I don't know what this is. And I don't know. I think 2024, we're going to start to see it, but I think it's going to take a little longer for people to really get past the headline is artificial intelligence, but I'm even starting to see it in some of my peer conversations where it's like, it's not really AI that's taking things by storm. It's the way we do content creation is radically different, or the way we do the conversation. And I think I predicted in 2023 and 2024 and beyond, we're going to see a lot more action learning and experiential learning, not necessarily XR, but more this, how do we give people that personalized immersive experience, or not immersive, but personalized action experience, because we don't just have to have passive consumption anymore. And I think those are going to be some of the things that are going to be really interesting to watch. Where do people start to apply this as they experiment?
A couple of things out of that, Christopher. Firstly, I completely agree that this idea of AI is a sort of amorphous, huge blob is
Yeah.
starting to come a bit more into focus now. It's almost like you're in a boat and you're coming towards something which just looks like this huge grey lump. As you get closer, details start to emerge, and it's clear that this thing is something that's much closer, and then there's something else that's further away. It's a bunch of separate things that all look like one thing, but actually they're very different. And yes, it might be personalization, it might be content, it might be something else. Another thing is, I'd say this is very analogous to the early adoption of electricity in the early 20th century. Then, when it was first coming out, and of course, the very first uses of electricity were in the late Victorian era, but then it was, oh my goodness, electricity. But you wouldn't say that now. You'd say, well, yeah, we've got electric cars, we've got motors to do this and motors to do that. And interestingly, when electricity was first used, it was used in exactly the same way as steam engines were. Now, in a steam engine, because you've got a very expensive single unit of power, you put that in one place and you drive a bunch of belts off it to run a factory. And so you have these cables, these belts running across the top of the factory, and then not belts, sorry, crankshafts, and then off that you have your belts running to run individual machines. And they replaced these large steam engines with large electric engines because they were doing a boombox. It was just doing the same thing, but a bit louder and a bit better. Then they worked out, oh, actually, we can use electricity individually in different places. So we work out how to do it as we go. But the other thing which you mentioned, which I'm 100% with, is that, yes, content creation is going to be where people are going to start with this. And all the research shows that. I did a survey last November with Egla Vinauskaite looking at, it was on the anniversary, we launched it on the anniversary of GPT's launch. What have people been using AI for in L&D? Guess what? Content creation was number one. Number two was increasing efficiency. Number three, what people expected to get out of AI was personalization. That is one of two great areas where I see the next, well, content is one, but I think that's a special case. That's a straightforward boombox. We'll do it more, faster. Will it be better? I'm not sure. I think we'll have a lot of mediocre content being churned out. But the other two areas where I think we'll have a lot of AI use is personalization. And in fact, that survey backs that up. The other one, which we haven't seen so much of yet, but I believe is inevitable, is an increase in coaching tools using AI in some form, either to back up a human being, or you have a human being that is playing a quarterback or a reserve behind an automated coach. Now, when I say a coach, it could be doing a variety of things. It could have subject matter expertise. It could simply be asking questions which demand reflection and it will then ask further questions to probe. That's already happening, and it is incredibly powerful and scalable in a way that other things are. The promise of that is very different to the promise of content creation. Content creation is a straightforward boombox. We can do the same thing faster. But the promise of coaching using AI is that we can now scale something which previously was impossible to scale because it relied on people. That's a huge leap forward. That's very much beyond a boombox. That's very much doing the old thing, but in a new way. And I find that very exciting and potentially very valuable for people to get hold of something which previously was only possible for the higher ups in the organization.
Well, and I think that's, again, like you said, as you look at the cycles of these things, well, I think I've watched, plenty of conversations through social media, improving content creation and creating more noise. I get why it's taken some pot shots. But again, I think it's that natural innovation phase. People are doing what they're familiar with, albeit faster and louder and things like that. And in some ways, it's funny you bring up the personalization piece. In some ways, I actually think AI creating more noise through content is actually going to drive the need for AI to help personalize because of the fact that it's like people are so saturated with, I don't even know what's good anymore. So how do I even find what's relevant to me in that? It's like, it's actually interesting how it's kind of the dog chasing its tail, where you're like, well, okay, I guess you're creating more use cases. But the part that does get me excited about that is around the doing things that historically have just been impossible in the past because of scale, cost, things like that. I just even think about, and the power and effectiveness that they have. I think about several years ago, implementing a simple text messaging engine that was based on something that we were doing that just did basic reinforcement based on
Yeah.
certain
Yeah.
milestones that
Yeah.
people hit. And the feedback from people was, this actually helped me get better at this. And it's like, okay, but that was the basic, rudimentary thing. Now we can do this on a scale of improvement that is exponentially better. And I think the other one that you hinted a little bit backstage is the analytics and data that will come. Now, I think what's interesting about that, because I do see a lot, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. I see a lot of talk about the data and analytics. And I don't know that we're going to get there as fast as people are talking about, because quite frankly, what AI is good at on data and analytics is only as good as the quality of the data that you have and put it on. And so if you throw AI at completely useless garbage data, it's going to come up with useless garbage insights super fast. And I think where we are today is because we haven't moved through that stage of coaching, reinforcement, experiential action learning type thing, we aren't necessarily creating a whole lot of meaningful data that we can necessarily layer AI on top of to tell us. Now, I do think there's some really powerful applications where we can put it on business data to start to see human trends. What are people doing? Even with the Office suite, like where are the social connections and how do people, there's some ways that we can do it. But I think a lot of our industry is focusing on like, yeah, we can throw AI on our LMS data. And I'm like, and it's going to tell you absolutely nothing that's not going to help you. I think we have to go through that middle stage to get to a point where we can actually do it. Now, I think some people are there, but I'm curious your reaction to that.
Well, I think most people's view of data is exactly what you say in L&D, unfortunately, which is, oh, it's about my LMS. But it really isn't. And the
Yes.
phrase that we have on the survey is learning analytics. And it's been pointed out to me a few times that should really say business analytics. Well, I believe business analytics is very important, but the phrase that is in people's minds is learning analytics, and that has held up very well this year. There's a sense that as well as AI going through the roof and obscuring everything else, the options which actually went up this year were personalization, learning analytics, and then skills-based talent management went down by 0.1%. So we can count that as a win. So those three, personalization, analytics, and skills-based talent management, are the areas where people are also interested as well as AI. And guess what? They're all data-driven one way or the other.
Yeah.
We have to ask ourselves, okay, does that mean that people have an astute, clear understanding of what AI, of what data is, and how to use it well in order to answer questions about business? And the answer is no. Almost certainly
No.
they don't. Anecdotally, we know that's not where we are. You're 100% correct that AI is best used for L&D right now is to query and make sense of business data. Is the L&D world ready to get hold of and make sense of that data by asking the right questions? I don't think they are, sadly.
Yeah. I think we're in could we do it? And I think this is one of the reasons I love the industry we're in is I tell people you can be into anything and find a home in our industry because again, like one of my leading analysts, he doesn't have an L&D background. He's a business analyst.
Yeah.
And we're doing a lot with him to be able to look at things and be able to say, hey, what's really here? And again, going back to it, I think AI is actually going to hopefully, I hope this is to me where I have my doubts on humanity. I hope it forces us to actually question things before we just start reacting to what we see. Because as an example, we started digging into some of the analytics on some of our business data. And then we started going, before we just react to this, is this data actually telling us what we think it's telling us?
Right.
And let's review that first. And when we got into it, we actually realized we were asking the wrong questions. We were gathering the wrong data from the business. And it actually forced us to rethink things because we realized, actually, if we do our analysis on this, it's completely wrong. And even some of the culture survey and some of the stuff around talent management, we realized these aren't even the right questions to be asking people to get the data and insights we need to be able to throw AI. And I think that's one of the risks that I keep warning people about is, hey, don't just think because you have what seems like good data and you throw AI at it, you're going to get an incredible result.
Danny Johnson does a great job of doing a survey of what's available in the learning tech space. Danny Johnson, Red Thread. And one of her observations is that every platform offers analytics. They offer analytics because, as we know, people want to buy something with analytics. But she also observes, or actually it might be me observing it, that those analytics engines are very seldom put through their paces at all. It's like, the analogy is familiar, going to the shops in your Ferrari and you're filling up the boot with your, I don't know, your bread and your milk, when you could easily do that with a compact car. And I think it's a shame that we want this stuff. We know it's important, but we're not quite sure what to do with it. Your story is great because understanding where the gaps are and what we should be doing with the data is really what's important. It's like we were talking about earlier, this sense that, oh, I've made a mistake there, but I've learned from it now. Whereas, unfortunately, I think too many people in L&D are happy to take numbers at face value or data points at face value. Oh, this says this, right, I'll go and report that. Well, no, that's not your job. Your job is to ask, what does that mean? What is this telling me? And that's with the Global Sentiment Survey. I spend a lot of time in this sort of ruminative state of being halfway between having finished the survey, got the data in, and then having to present it to people. And I just have to look at the numbers and say, okay, well, that's interesting. What does this mean? I play with it a bit and that doesn't look right. And I go away and I come back and I try something else. And there's that iterative process of trying out, if you like, hypotheses and answering them, and then being cautious about the results, which we need to develop as a skill generally in L&D. The technology is there, it's way ahead of what we could do with it, but we have to develop the nous, the skill to use that data and to ask the second question. What does this mean? How do I take that further? That's where I think we're a bit lacking at the moment.
Well, and I think going back to, again, some of the underlying trends of all that's going on societally and on the technology front, it's a lot of people are left asking, in this technology-driven future, what purpose do I serve anymore? And one of the things that's not necessarily a popular message I've discovered is that I'm like, if you are continuing to do what we just described, if shelling out more content or being the person who takes the results and presents the results, and that's it, you are at a high risk of being obsoleted by technology, because quite frankly, the technology is moving at a pace where it's like, that's not actually where the value is. It's in that follow-up of, even in content generation, if your job is just to create the thing, I've had AI able to create content better than humans for a lot longer than 2022. But where it's been interesting is the human skills of questioning it, analyzing it, interpreting context, because AI does not have context. It's terrible at that. So contextualizing these things, asking the follow-up questions, digging into it, deeply understanding, that is where I think as an industry, and I don't think that's unique to L&D, I think that's across the board, that it's like, that is where you can start to focus your niche. And that goes back to the beginning of our conversation of honing in on your niche as well. My niche is contextualizing, asking these things, understanding these bigger pictures, that then AI feeds me the stuff to do that at a faster pace. But I think that is a real risk. We can kind of transition into some of the challenges you see being presented by these sentiment surveys, because you said you want to get there. But to me, that's one of the biggest ones is like, we have to make a shift, not just as an industry, but I think our industry in particular does, or we are at risk.
Well, look, actually, it's a lovely quick transition into those challenges people see, because you're highlighting something that's absolutely true, which is that when I started training as a stand-up trainer, before the World Wide Web was even invented, it was proposed in 1989, and I was training before that, the job of the learning and development professional was what it had been for decades, if not 100 plus years beforehand, which was to be the center of information, to create and distribute information. And you did that via a class or via a book or some printed matter, and that was it. The legacy, because that's been such a long history, the legacy is enduring, and that is still how we see ourselves and how the world sees us, but it is no longer our role. Well, sorry,
Yes.
our role has remained the same, which is to, in my view, help individuals and organizations flourish, help them meet their potential. That's what
Yep.
we do.
Connect the dots. I see us as dot connectors.
There we go. But the way we do it, the tools have certainly changed. We don't do it by creating content anymore. Sometimes that's important, but there are other areas where we can have a far greater impact than creating content. One of the great ones is by, as we've talked about already, encouraging innovative uses of coaching. Another is surfacing tacit information. The information that sits in people's heads in organizations is immensely powerful and useful. If we could surface it, we could make organizations far more effective. We don't tend to see that as being our role, but in a world where people can share stuff rapidly with each other but can't find the right people, in a world where anybody can create really good looking content fast, helping connect the dots, helping put the right people together, helping surface what they know and share it more widely is a super important job for L&D. So let's talk about the challenges that people have got this year. So I asked that question, what is the key challenge that you face this year in L&D? For the past 2 years, 40% of people responding to the survey have answered that question. This year it was 94%. Now that's a big jump.
Whoa.
That's a big jump. So what happened? I think what happened is
Whoa.
we got really worried about some stuff this year. And of course, the big one is technology. Guess what? AI is both the thing that's going to be hot this year, and it's also the thing that people are super worried about. 60 people responded just saying AI. Technology as a whole, as a collection of things people were concerned about, went from being the 9th of the 9 categories I have to the 1st of the 9 categories. So it's a super thing that people are worried about. But the other things that are on the increase are budget. Each year for the past 3 years, when I say budget, I mean resources. So budget, resources, time, the ability to get things done. That's an increasing concern for people. Interestingly, though, the ones that remain the same, they're always in the top 3 or 4, are training and skills. People are really concerned about identifying the skills for people and just being able to deliver. So delivery as a category on itself is one of the main things that people are concerned about. In other words, how do I get my job done? That still remains the thing people are most concerned about. But I think what's happened is that the rise of AI and the talk about it has led to a sort of increased level of concern and anxiety across the board with everything. And people are concerned about how they can do their day job. Yeah. So I think we should recognize that and say to people what we were saying at the beginning, look, please give yourself time to get in control of this stuff. And I would say that if there's one thing you can do to give yourself time to get in control of your daily schedule, it is to create less content. It's hugely time consuming typically, and most of the time it's probably not needed. If you can stop producing 1/10 of the material, maybe 5%, 1/5 of the material you're producing, if you can get to that level, then you're going to give yourself a lot of time back. And that means you've got to start having difficult conversations with people, but probably they're the right conversations to have.
And that, 2 things that you said there that I think really stand out. So the first one being your recommendation, I think, is spot on. And whether your immediate response is creating less content or finding ways to create content faster, so you're spending less of your time on it. Yes. And I think that is one of the things that AI can add a lot of value to is you can say, listen, but again, we got to get over ourselves in being able to go, we have to let go of, well, I have to get it exactly the way I would do it and say, the overall value of this is not super high. So we're going to either say no, or we're going to automate it so that it's like, it's there and it's out, and we're not going to invest a ton of time and energy into it. And I can say that's a hard shift to make.
Yes.
To your point, it's difficult conversations, and it's just difficult to get. I mean, I've led L&D teams, and sometimes they're just like, you want us to do what? And I'm like, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but you're spot on in terms of the effectiveness.
Listen, if you're listening to this podcast or you're watching it wherever, and you are saying to yourself, great, I can shift my hours spent producing content with AI. I can shift it from 10 hours a week to 1 hour, just round numbers.
Yep.
What are you going to do with those remaining 9 hours? Please please do not use them to create more content. The world
Yes.
doesn't need more content, and you won't be doing yourself a service. Use those 9 hours to invest in building your network in the organization, understanding it better, and growing your understanding of what's going on in the world of AI and other tech developments. And that way, you'll be serving yourself and your organization and the people in it much better.
We'll just clip that and make it a short, because I mean, really, I have said so many times, the risk we run with AI is we end up just running faster on the treadmill instead of saying, hey, with that time we are freeing up,
Yeah.
let's use it for other things that are actually higher value add. You can still deliver the same thing, but just do it more efficiently so you can focus on this. But I think one of the things that you brought up that I'm hypersensitive to is one of the things that I do think is unique about artificial intelligence and what's happened with it is it has shaken people's identity to its
Correct.
core
Correct.
more than anything ever has, where
Yeah.
suddenly people are going, what really is my value, or what is my identity in this? And so I'm sensitive to that, because when I talk to people, a lot of the exhaustion, when I dig under the surface, it's rooted in fear.
Yes.
It's rooted in this fear of, am I becoming irrelevant as a human being in my organization? And in some ways, like to my family, to my friend, like, am I just becoming nothing? And I think helping people through that and seeing the path forward and seeing there is a way, and that is actually not, that is what you were doing before was not where your inherent value was. So here's how you bring it differently. I think helping people through that identity crisis can actually be one of the most effective ways to navigate this.
Super important. And I would sum it up as this: the tools have changed, but the role hasn't. We
Yeah.
are still helping individuals and organizations fulfill their potential. That's still our role. We just have a different tool for doing it. Shift our mindset from being obsessed very often with producing beautiful stuff to thinking about how we help people do their jobs as well as they can.
Yep. I think that's absolutely accurate. And just from, again, my anecdotal experience, when I've leaned into that, when I've done that over the years, when I've encouraged my teams and coached them to do the same thing, our value in the organization has only increased exponentially.
Yes.
You know, we've sustained the layoffs, we've sustained the budget cuts, we've actually grown at times when others are shrinking, because when we really lean into what our core purpose is instead of the activity,
Yes.
that's when all of a sudden you unlock doors that were previously just felt impenetrable.
I think you have reached the summit of the entire episode here. You've planted your flag on the summit.
Okay, there you go.
waving it.
Well, well, with that, I really hope that again, I so appreciate you joining me, Don, to just even share some of these insights. And this has been a really powerful conversation. And I hope it serves as an encouragement while meeting people where they are, but also giving them a path forward, because
I hope so.
There is a path forward. And I am sensitive to the noise and I'm sensitive to all the stuff going on. But I think, if anything, your survey is revealing some of these things to be true and hopefully help people make these next couple years a positive one. So thank you for making the time.
Been great to be here. Really enjoyed the conversation, Christopher.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching, listening, wherever you are. Thanks always. And feel free to share it with somebody who would benefit from it. And we will see you on the other side.